My next guest is a disability rights activist and internationally recognized leader in the disability community. With 30 plus years working as an activist, Judith Heumann is one of the world's leading voices on the rights and independence of all persons with disabilities. Judy, welcome to today's program.
Thank you very much for having me.
Thank you. So just to start off with, I wanted to talk about your own experience in this realm, how you got involved in this. You hear about disability rights to some degree, but it's not covered, I think, in the news media, the field I work in, as much as it maybe should be.
I think that's a very important comment that you're making, recognizing the fact that the issue of disabled people is not being appropriately covered. I think means that we can then look at people like yourself, who in fact will now be looking at how disability is absent and what needs to happen. For myself, I'm 72 years old and I had polio in 1949. I grew up in a time where we didn't have laws like Section 504, which prohibited discrimination and prohibits discrimination against disabled people in programs receiving money from the federal government, or the Americans with Disabilities Act, which celebrates its 30th anniversary this year. And so myself, like millions of other disabled people in the United States and a billion disabled people around the world, have experienced discrimination that in many cases was not labeled as discrimination. And the fact that we've been able to advance the issue of discrimination, allowing both disabled people to understand what they should and should not accept, and also the broader society to understand what discrimination is, what to do to prevent it, and what we can do as a society to remove the barriers that really been limiting our contributions.
It's interesting. The Civil Rights Act was signed in 1964, but people with disabilities notably weren't covered in that. Why do you think the disability community wasn't even on the radar at Congress at the time?
Well, at that time, I would say there really wasn't a disability movement. I would say the most active group were disabled veterans who came back from the Second World War. It was really later in the 60s that we began to see the development of more small disability rights groups on college campuses, community organizations at local communities, some statewide organizations. But in the later 60s, I think the disability community was learning a lot from the civil rights movement. I think I talk about television as being a really important aspect because obviously newspapers and radio are very important, and magazines, etc. But television's really brought into our living rooms the way that Black Americans were addressing issues of discrimination and putting their lives on the line. And I think for many of us, that was really a pivotal point in recognizing that we needed to look at coming together. I think another issue in disability is that people are always thinking about curing disabled people. So there's a bigger emphasis on cure than there is on my life as a disabled person, and how I have a right as a disabled person to all the benefits as others. And so I think that's another big shift that has been going on over the last 50, 60 years, moving from a medical model to a disability rights, human rights model, both here and around the world.
Do you think there's an understanding or large enough understanding among most people in the year 2020 of how many obstacles people living with disabilities face every day?
No. I mean, I think if people really, I think it's a combination of, do they realize it? And then do they realize why these obstacles are there? And do they realize what role they're playing? And I think it's very important that we're looking at those of us with visible disabilities and invisible disabilities. We need to be looking at the fact that disability cuts across all aspects of everyone's life. We're talking about Black disabled people, Latino disabled people, Asian disabled people from the LGBTQ community, on and on. And we're looking at people who have deafness, hard of hearing, blindness, low vision, all forms of physical disabilities, people with intellectual disabilities, depression, anxiety, bipolar, other kinds of mental health disabilities, on and on. And so we're a very big swath of the American society, 61 million disabled people. We're not all born with our disabilities. Most people are acquiring their disabilities over the course of their lives. And in many ways, the stigma that we face as disabled people also really has resulted in many people not speaking up about the fact that they have a disability, because disability is seen as something negative. For me and the movement, we are looking at disability as a normal part of life. And that not only do we have to be speaking up and out, but I believe it's very important that non-disabled people really get a better understanding of the role that they need to be playing in helping advance our movement, because many people will acquire a disability temporarily or permanently, and will have family members who acquire a temporary or permanent disability. We need to be looking at COVID. What is COVID showing us? Many things. But one is people living in nursing homes and other institutionalized settings are dying at much higher rates than others. We need to be looking at poverty and the link of race and what people are calling underlying conditions, diabetes and other forms of disabilities that are not being called disabilities. We need, as a society, to be recognizing the fact that as we're looking at diversity, as I believe we're really struggling with making some major shifts within our society, disabled people need to be on that list. We need to be at that table. We need to consciously be being invited.
And on the note you mentioned before about intersectionality in the movement, I want to talk about your experience, being an advocate in this area. Did you face sexism being in combating, discrimination against people living with disabilities?
So I would say that the first thing that I faced was discrimination because I had a disability. Within the disability community, certainly, we mirrored much of what was going on within the general society. So the role of disabled women within the disability movement is one that we've continually, as disabled women, had to fight for. And so I would say there are many similarities within the movement. But really, the discrimination that I faced in the job that I was denied as a teacher and having to litigate and other forms of discriminatory events that I've experienced, maybe my gender had something to do with it, but I would say the predominant issue was my disability. People's belief that I couldn't make the same contributions. And really, I think when you speak to many other disabled people, we have the same experiences. People's viewing us as inferior, inadequate, not giving us opportunities like they may give others. The fear if you hire someone who has a disability and they don't do a good job, how could you ever fire them? So therefore, I'm never going to hire one. And, in the community, it's kind of a joke. Hire a disabled person. If they don't do a good job, you're never going to hire a disabled person again. So for me, I've often thought when I've hired non-disabled people, if I hire a non-disabled person and they don't do a good job, does that mean I'm never going to hire another non-disabled person? Obviously not. But I just think that we're not treated equally. We're not seen equally. People do not understand the depth of the discrimination that people experience. And laws like the Americans with Disabilities Act, I think, are very important because there are many changes that are being made in our society. For example, the infrastructure of our society is really dramatically changing in a way that is providing many of us with opportunities that we didn't previously have. But when the law was passed in 1990, the internet and technology were really not at the same level as they are in 2020. And so there's much work that continues to need to be done to ensure that the technology which is being created is going to, in fact, not limit our opportunities as disabled people, but expand our opportunities like others. We need to make sure that disabled people are getting the same quality education as non-disabled people, regardless of the type of disability we have.
Right, and I hope that work continues, Judy. Thank you so much for your time today, and I hope this conversation continues outside of this virtual conversation.